Good evening and welcome to NTD UK News. I'm Stuart Lees. Here are today's top stories. The Education Secretary promises to move heaven and earth to avoid shutting schools again after they reopen this week. Britain's leading paediatricians say research shows the risk of long COVID among children is much lower than they feared. And as headlines link extreme weather events with the climate, some say the science behind climate change studies is flawed.
We have to look at the data as it comes in and maintain a humility in terms of our knowledge about the climate, which is always improving and always advancing. But we don't have the perfect model of the climate as of yet.
Pupils will be returning to school in the next few days. Education Secretary Gavin Williamson says he is determined to avoid shutting schools again. NTD's Eddie Aitken has more on this.
As schools across the UK resume classes after the summer holidays, there have been concerns that it could spark a rise in CCP virus cases. But Education Secretary Gavin Williamson told the media that he will move heaven and earth to make sure schools don't need to be closed again. Schools in Scotland returned 2 weeks ago, and the reopenings believed to have contributed to a rise in cases north of the border. Williamson did not deny that schools reopening may cause more infections, but he's confident the government's testing programme is the right way to fight the virus. He says the government is trying to strike a balance between handling the pandemic and giving children a normal educational experience. He also said pupils will be able to take their GCSEs and A-level exams at the end of this school year. He added after exams were cancelled for 2 years in a row, nobody wants to see a third year of that. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
Leading child health experts say the risk of long COVID among children is much lower than they had feared. NTD's Cos Terminus has the details.
The world's largest study on long COVID in children says 1 in 7 who get the virus could have symptoms almost 4 months later. The research says children who tested positive were twice as likely to report 3 or more symptoms 15 weeks later than those who tested negative. The symptoms include unusual tiredness and headaches. The study, led by University College London and Public Health England, looked at almost 7,000 children aged 11 to 17. Half of them had a positive PCR test between January and March, whilst the other half tested negative in the same period. The researchers say their findings will be presented to the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization, which has yet to give a decision on jabs for all 12 to 15-year-olds. They say the data suggests that between September and March, at least 4,000 11 to 17-year-olds who tested positive in England had long COVID. The number could be as high as 32,000. But the researchers believe the actual number of children with long COVID could be lower. That's because those with ongoing symptoms are more likely to complete the survey. Lead author Professor Sir Terence Stevenson says he feels reassured that data is nowhere near what people thought in the worst-case scenario. But he also says he remains very concerned some young people could be severely affected. Cos Terminus, NTD News.
The Scottish Government has proposed vaccine certificates to enter nightclubs and large live events. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says they hope to implement the measures quickly. NTD's Eddie Aitken brings us the story.
The Scottish Government proposes vaccine certificates for nightclubs and adult entertainment venues, and vaccinated people will be barred entry. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon says the government recognises these venues are important to the economy.
But they are not essential services, and the nature of them, which involves bringing many people together in relatively small areas, does mean that despite their very best efforts, and I know they make their best efforts, they can continue to contribute significantly to the spread of the virus.
Sturgeon says the Scottish Government believes vaccine certificates should not be required for key services. This includes public transport, education, health services or shops. She says it is also not appropriate to introduce the certificate across the hospitality industry.
But we do consider that a limited use of vaccine certification could help to control the spread of the virus as we head into the autumn and winter.
Scots will need to show their certificates to enter large-scale live events and events with over 10,000 people. Sturgeon says Scotland hopes to implement the proposal quickly.
We propose, subject to parliamentary agreement, that vaccination certification should be introduced later this month, once all adults have had the opportunity to be fully vaccinated.
Scotland reported over 6,000 cases on Wednesday, 5 times higher than a month ago. The First Minister says the situation is extremely concerning, and it is by no means impossible that Scotland could see 10,000 new cases a day. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
To Italy now, who this week made their COVID-19 pass mandatory for travellers on domestic flights, trains and ships. Many have welcomed the measure, while some are threatening to block train tracks in protest. Here's NTD's Trevor Piper with more on this.
Italy began requiring domestic travellers to show a so-called green pass this week, amid threats of disruptive protests. The rule applies to domestic flights, trains between regions and sea travel. Local buses, trams and metros are exempt. The pass shows someone has received a vaccine dose, tested negative for COVID, or recovered in the past 6 months. Passengers at Rome train station are in favour of the measure.
I have no problems at all with the Green Pass. I judge it a useful decision because it is very helpful for the safety of all the passengers that are travelling around Italy.
I think the Green Pass is very useful. It is necessary because it is necessary that people get vaccinated. The Green Pass should be compulsory everywhere, also for the health of other people, not only mine.
At the airport, travellers say the vaccines are their most effective protection.
Since we're all vaccinated, there's less chance of us getting COVID, and there's less chance of us spreading it to other people who maybe aren't vaccinated outside of the airport.
Look, I did get vaccinated and I'm pregnant. I firmly believe in what science says, not anything else.
There have been several protests against the pass. The government says it will crack down on demonstrators threatening to block train tracks throughout the country. Trevor Piper, NTD News.
In Denmark, the situation is different. The country has now dropped the requirement for a COVID-19 pass for most venues. Back in April, the Nordic country was one of the early adopters of the scheme. The pass certifies a vaccination or negative test status and was mandatory for going to restaurants, gyms and to the hairdressers. Now it only remains in place for major indoor public events and nightclubs. With 71% of the population fully vaccinated, authorities say the epidemic is now under control, though not yet over. On the 10th of September, Denmark plans to lift all COVID-19 restrictions. To other news now, as parts of Spain are surveying the damage left by flash floods that hit on Wednesday. Thousands were left without power and rails and roads were closed from a heavy storm. NTD's John Robson brings us more on this.
Firefighters on Wednesday, working to clear muddy roads of stranded cars, washed away in floodwaters after an intense storm wreaked havoc in parts of Spain. The Catalan town of Alcanar was hit hardest, but no fatalities were reported. Cars, furniture and trees were swept down streets toward the Mediterranean. Emergency services rescued dozens of people trapped in vehicles and houses. Around 7,000 homes in the area of Spain's northeastern town lost power. Local roads and rail links were interrupted. Catalonia's emergency services say 3 people were treated for hypothermia. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez warned on Wednesday evening that many provinces were on alert for more heavy rainfall and storms. Central Spain also saw heavy rains and mild flooding during the previous night, affecting the high-speed rail link between the capital Madrid and Toledo on Wednesday. The National Weather Service said the storms produced over 9,000 lightning strikes in one night. Joanne Robson, NTD News.
Many recent headlines link certain extreme weather events to climate change. But the head of policy at the Global Warming Policy Foundation says such links may not be so clear. Here's NTD's Jane Well with the story.
More money.
Climate change group Extinction Rebellion are protesting in London, demanding an end to fossil fuels. Protesters may not have caused quite as much disruption as they've known to in the past, but their demands are the same.
I really hope that they take seriously to divest from fossil fuels. That's the real big thing that's got to happen. And I hope with all my heart that something can happen.
If they're aware that, from the last IPCC report, they described it as code red. We are at an absolute tipping point. We have to do something, and we have to reduce our fossil fuel dependence. And so our demand is that we stop new investment. We stop any new fossil fuel funding and investments, and work for a global transition. So I think anybody can understand if we dig more oil out of the ground, more coal out of the ground, that's a bad thing now, because we have enough in our surplus.
The government's policies are already reflective of this in some ways. The UK government has committed to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, a plan that may include banning gas boilers in new homes in 4 years' time. Extinction Rebellion wants the UK to reach net zero by 2025. However, the head of policy at the Global Warming Policy Foundation says this target is unrealistic.
Well, I think certainly 2025 is completely unrealistic. We still see that the global economy is overwhelmingly powered by fossil fuels, and that's including countries like the UK as well as developing countries. So without those fuels, we would actually be plunged back into a sort of medieval style economy, and I don't think anyone serious is actually suggesting that net zero by 2025 is conceivable by any means. Looking to 2050 is a different question. There's a lot of uncertainty there. I don't think anyone can tell you for certain whether net zero by 2050 is possible. We would need a lot more technological development to happen for that to happen affordably. If governments choose technologies that are uncompetitive and force them on people and ban the alternatives that they prefer to use, then I think that ultimately won't achieve the results that are intended, and it will leave people much, much poorer than they would otherwise be.
Many reports link extreme weather events to climate change, which could lead to misconceptions.
How has that come about, really? It's easy to just be like, oh, we're in a big storm, it must be climate change.
Well, there's two sort of approaches here, and certain elements of the literature focus on looking at observational trends, and they will look at a country like the UK and look at river flows, look at reporting of extreme of flooding events and how that's changed over time. And we have good records, relatively speaking, in the UK on a lot of these meteorological records. But then there's a new kind of science that has come along called attribution science. Now, I think this is on much shakier ground, because this is comparing what we're seeing with a modelled version of reality, essentially without climate change. And so what they're doing is they're comparing what we've actually seen with what they predicted would have been the outcome without climate change. And then they're saying, well, this event that we're seeing was made X% worse or was made X% more likely because of climate change. But for me, this is not nearly as robust at looking at the actual data in terms of the flooding we've been seeing and the trends, because you're assuming that you have almost a perfect model of the climate. And there's so much variation, so much natural variability, and still so much uncertainty around climate models, that this just isn't a very robust way to sort of declare a link between climate change and extreme weather events. We have to be patient. We have to look at the data as it comes in, and maintain a humility in terms of our knowledge about the climate, which is always improving and always advancing. But we don't have the perfect model of the climate as of yet. So I think we should take with a pinch of salt scientists who come along and say, well, they know that this event was X% more likely.
Climate change policies will be discussed at the UN's COP26 climate summit, which will be held in the UK for the first time later on this year. More protests are expected then. Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.
Still to come, following a chaotic Afghanistan exit, the EU is looking at ways to develop a common defence. That and more after the break. The Foreign Secretary says Britain will not recognise the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, but the UK does need to engage directly with the group. NTD's Joy Duguid has the details.
On a visit to Qatar, Dominic Raab says the UK won't recognise the Taliban regime anytime soon. But there is an important scope for dialogue with Afghanistan's new rulers.
We don't recognise governments, we will not be recognising the Taliban, but we do see the need to be able to have direct engagement. Otherwise, we can't provide messages, we can't listen to the response.
The Taliban has promised to prevent terrorist groups from using Afghanistan as a base. It has also said it will allow safe passage for British nationals and vulnerable Afghans who haven't been evacuated. Raab said engagement is needed to test the Taliban's promises.
I think engagement will be important in order to set early tests, and what we'll be judging the Taliban by is their actions, not their words.
The UK government is having talks with the Taliban on how to evacuate British nationals and eligible Afghans who have been left behind. The Foreign Office has sent 15 crisis specialists to Afghanistan's neighbouring countries to help process those who are escaping over land borders. Joy Duguid, NTD News.
The chaotic Western withdrawal from Afghanistan could become a catalyst for the European Union to develop its common defence. European defence ministers were meeting today to discuss proposals like a European Rapid Reaction Force. NTD's Eddie Aitken has the story.
Still reeling from the European Union's shortcomings in Afghanistan, officials from the 27-nation bloc are discussing ways to improve their response to future crises and not be so reliant on the US. European ministers of defence on Thursday gathered in Slovenia.
Afghanistan ist ein bitteres Ende, ist eine schwere Niederlage.
Afghanistan is a bitter end, a serious defeat. Whether this is a permanent weakening of the West certainly depends on the question of what conclusions we draw and whether, as Europeans, we become more independent, able to act more autonomously, because our credibility depends on that ability.
Unsere Glaubwürdigkeit ab.
France and Germany wanted more time to complete evacuations of their citizens and Afghans during the airlift after the Taliban took control. But without the US forces, the EU was not able to protect Kabul airport for another 3 days beyond the 31st of August US withdrawal deadline. Ministers are now looking at a European Rapid Response Force capable of operating in difficult military theatres.
Now is the time to act, starting with the creation of a European Rapid Entry Forces able to show the will of the European Union to act as a global strategic partner. When, if not now?
The EU's foreign policy chief suggests a transitional force of 5,000 troops.
From time there are events that catalyzes the history, Sometimes something happens that pushes the history. It creates a breakthrough. And I think that the Afghanistan events of this summer is one of these cases.
Additionally, since 2007, the EU technically has had rotating battle groups, but efforts to deploy them, as in Chad and Libya, failed. Disputes over funding are an issue.
We have different initiatives, mechanisms. I have to emphasize, for example, European battle groups, but the mechanism how to start these units or how to send the soldiers somewhere abroad, it's too complicated.
He said the problem is the consensus required to activate them. Tonines suggests a majority may be sufficient, with countries being able to opt out of particular missions. The EU plans to present a draft proposal for a rapid defence force by November. Eddie Aitken, NTD News.
In the run-up to this month's parliamentary election in Russia, Authorities declared more than 20 media outlets and journalists as foreign agents. The editor-in-chief of one news outlet hit with that label says the government's destruction of independent outlets is a means to tighten state control. NTD's John Robson tells us more.
The editor-in-chief of a Russian investigative news outlet sees what he calls the destruction of independent media in the country as only the beginning. Roman Dobrokotov says it's about tightening state control. Authorities designated his outlet, The Insider, a foreign agent in July. The designation carries negative Soviet-era connotations and affects advertising revenue. Additionally, authorities searched his home and opened a criminal case against him for libel. Dobrokotov says the authorities' actions are an attack on civil society's democratic elements. The foreign agent designation came after The Insider investigated last year's poisoning of opposition politician Alexei Navalny, who's currently in prison. The outlet helped identify state security officials. It said it were behind the poisoning. The Kremlin has denied any responsibility. For Dobrokotov, the poisoning was the tipping point.
An assassination attempt against the main opposition leader is a serious step. As well as resetting Putin's term limits, I think that's when everything started to unravel.
Media outlets and journalists critical of the authorities have faced increasing pressure in the run-up to the parliamentary election this month. The ruling United Russia party that supports President Vladimir Putin has never faced a serious challenge. Dobrokotov says he expects the bulk of his staff to relocate abroad.
You need to choose whether you continue to do your job, in which case you have to leave Russia, or become a political prisoner like Navalny. In his case, it possibly makes sense. He is now like a Russian Nelson Mandela. But if dozens of journalists join him, Russia will not benefit.
He said The Insider plans to continue its reporting, even on sensitive topics. Joanne Robson, NTD News.
After losing his hives to the Asian giant Hornet, a French beekeeper got inventive. He came up with a trap that stops the invasive species but does no harm to bees or native hornets. Lucy Fodor reports.
When he lost 35 hives to the invasive Asian hornet, French beekeeper Denis Jaffray knew he must act quickly. Asian hornets have no natural predators and can eat through an entire hive in a few hours. They have decimated bee colonies across Europe. Jaffray lost the hives in Brittany in 2016.
I thought to myself I had to find a solution at all costs. I would even think about it at night. I took to having a pencil and paper on my bedside table to write down whatever ideas I had, because I was so traumatised by the loss of half my hives that year. It was a catastrophe.
What Jaffray came up with was a one-way trap like a lobster pot to catch the hornets, which are thought to have arrived in France in 2004 in a pottery shipment from China. Attracted by a sugary bait, the hornets get in through a funnel, then can't get out, while smaller insects, including bees, can escape through tiny holes. Originally made from a wooden wine crate and metal mesh, the traps are now 3D printed in plastic. Jaffray received a French Inventors Prize in 2018 and started making the traps in bulk, employing 6 workers. Demand is so high he has had to pause taking orders. Fellow beekeeper Christian Petit was one of the first to try out a prototype.
If you don't set up traps, you see the hornets fly in front of the beehive entrance. They choose their menu. They catch a bee and they fly away with it to go and cut it into pieces in a quiet little bush.
Jaffray also removes hornet nests from homes and gardens, but said while it prevents nasty accidents, it does little to stop the spread. The only way to combat the threat, he says, would be systematic trapping all over the country, with local government support.
Next, an unlikely venue has been transformed into an underground guest house. A bunker built by German troops in World War II welcomes visitors after being buried for years. NTD's Joy Duguid brings us the story.
In Saint-Pabu, at the Breton seaside, concrete bunkers are half buried along sandy beaches. Bunker enthusiast Serge Colliou bought a plot of land and transformed one into a guest house.
Hello, welcome to the L479 bunker. Follow me for a visit.
Alors ici, vous êtes dans le
Here we are in the dining room.
pour passer un agréable moment. Ici, on se trouve dans la salle à
There is a table where you can have 15 guests.
Vous êtes dans le bar.
You are in the bar, the bunker's most important room. Just look at this. Here, as you can see, there is my personal reserve, because guests aren't the only ones who party here.
The 400 square metre bunker took over a year to convert. It is now a fully functioning rental, complete with bar and cosy living room.
Renovating the bunker was a lot of cleaning, a lot of elbow grease. Then you paint, etc. Overall, it took 18 months of work, but not in a rush. It mostly was difficult for the craftsman. The digger especially had a lot of work. The electrician as well. Otherwise, we did everything ourselves.
Memorabilia like helmets and reproductions of guns decorate the space. French visitors and foreigners have stayed since it opened a year ago. Bunkers can be seen along the entire coast.
It is part of the history of Brittany and the Breton coast, because we have hundreds, thousands of bunkers, blockhouses. They are really part of the landscape, and you can't have a walk on the coast without seeing one every 100 or 200 meters. People have taken over the site, but the plants have taken over in some places, so it's always interesting to see the variations from one site to another.
Hervé Farrant is a bunker specialist and author who began to explore the structures in the 1980s.
We are starting to preserve those famous bunkers, and it's a good thing. But we cannot save them all. That is where the problem lies. They are everywhere. Just around here there must be around 200 bunkers, you see?
A night in the bunker costs around £300. Joy Duguid, NTD News.
That's the news for today, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Stuart Lees. Thank you for watching our daily news show on YouTube. You can also watch our other programming on channel 190 on Sky TV or on Freeview via channel box on channel 271. In the meantime though, please give this video a like and hit subscribe to our channel. Have a good day.